What's up, family? This is the origins of the N-word. So this word is a very ancient word, actually. And it was a divine word back in ancient times. Back in Kemet, with the Cushites and the Kemites, is where this word originated at. And it was pronounced Ngr, spelled N-G-R. There's no syllables in the Kemetic language, so that's how this was pronounced. Also, this word originated in Ethiopia also. It was pronounced Negus, spelled N-E-G-U-S. Now, both words basically mean pharaoh, king, god, forms of nobility. And it was reserved for the royalty usually. Now, in due time, the word evolved once it got into contact with Europeans. Various groups like the Greeks, who first came in contact with it, and the Romans, then the Spanish, and then the British. In the beginning of when the Europeans first came across this word, it still meant something positive and noble. And they adopted this word, the Europeans did, in referencing the African peoples, so-called black-skinned peoples, that they were coming in contact with. Now, later down the line, when this word gets over to America, though, it starts to take a shift. Now, at this point, the word had already had syllables added to it, because in the European languages, there's syllables. So, when it got over here to America, the term Negro, which came from the Spanish, that word had popped up. And so that was the beginning of this word's downfall. So the black peoples that were already over here, the black Native Americans, and then the Moorish enslaved peoples from the Moorish Empire, when that fell, they were brought over here as well. The name was used on them. And then the continental Africans that were enslaved and brought over here to the Americas also. So you have these three groups of black, quote unquote, peoples over here in America that this word was being used on. Now, also, though, during these timelines, the word Moor was still being used to an extent. That was a word that the Europeans would use basically to talk about African peoples. So it was the Moors that, controlled various parts of Europe during the Moorish Empire era. But then they also used this word as a blanket term for black people in general from African descent. So that word existed also. So they were calling us Moor, and they were also calling us, when we got over here, the groups that were over here, Negro. Now, then another term evolves after that, during the slavery era. And this is when, basically, when they brought the Irish over here to the Americas, when the British brought them over here, a new term for this word evolved. Now, because the people that they brought over from Ireland, a lot of times they were like the lower income, less educated peoples that they brought over here, less affluent. And so their English was not the proper English that the British spoke. So it had more of a slang sound to it. When they pronounced words, slurs was involved in their pronunciations also. But so they added the I into it. And then the E near the end of it. So then the word nigger evolved. Now, basically when they started using this term, it was a negative term then, because of the tone of how they were using it for these black peoples that were here in America, the ones that were enslaved. So they would constantly use this word in reference to the black peoples, but they would use it in a negative tone. So what would happen is, over generations, there were the black peoples that were over here during the slave era. They started using the word that was being used on them, and the pronunciation of how the Irish gave it to them. But since they didn't know any better at that time, because it was a generational thing, they just assumed that this word was reserved for them. So they thought they were this word and this pronunciation of how it was. And they didn't even know that this word actually in ancient times was a divine word that came from Africa. They didn't know this. So they were using this word, and then, as time progressed, this word started to become urban and then a hip thing that occurred. So whenever this occurs, the word is kind of losing the negativity in a sense. Yeah, it's still negative for a while, but it started becoming a hip term when the hip hop scene popped up, when the Native Black Americans created hip hop. This word was very popular in urban dialects as well amongst the black peoples. So essentially what was going on is Native Black Americans took back this word that was originally divine, then it became negative, and then they made it a hip, cool term in urban dialect. And to this day, now, only the black peoples over here can use this term. So in a way, we've brought this word back. Now, it doesn't have its exact divinity that it did in ancient times, but that's due to the fact that a lot of people of the Black American community do not know the originality of this term and what it meant. They just know it in its form now, in the hip, urban, cool form that it is now. But if we can get this information to the masses, in an ideal, perfect world, we would start pronouncing it like the ancient ancestors did over there in Africa, which is either Inger or Negus, either of those two forms. That takes away all of the negativity that still exists with this term from all of the historical damage that it did on the black community when it was using a negative term. Let me know what you think in the comments. Should Black Americans, and even furthermore, the diaspora that uses the word, should we continue to use this word, or should we get rid of it? This is Taj's Empowerment Channel.